Hello and welcome to the Guitar Hang Podcast. I'm your host, John Stancorp. Today is a special episode as I shine a spotlight on the incredible Jazz Obrecht. Jazz is not only just a guitar player, columnist, and author, he's a true blues aficionado. His passion for the blues has taken him on an unforgettable journey, including cherished friendships with legends like John Lee Hooker and Edward Van Halen. In this exclusive chat, we'll dive into Jazz's deep love for the blues, his remarkable career as a columnist and author, and the unforgettable moments he shared with some of the biggest names in the music industry. Please make sure you hit the subscribe button below and ring the bell for notifications. And now, let's hang with Jazz Obrecht. Getting started, I'm really enjoying your Talking Guitar series.
Hey, thanks. It's a pleasure doing them, I'll tell you that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's as what seems to be a lifelong guitar player magazine devotee, subscriber. I mean, absolutely live by this because it predated all the other magazines, and to me, and I think a lot of us, we consider it to be the top publication for anything guitar related.
You know, John, I was lucky to be in the right place at the right time because when I joined in May of '78, there weren't any other guitar magazines in America. And we had a staff of like three editors altogether. So it was like a field day for getting interviews with people for the three of us.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a time in the 70s for me that was exciting because there was so many concerts that you could go to see at any given time. Not as much in Cincinnati where I grew up as some of the other big cities, but that was a lifeline. And in between shows, the thing that kind of got you through in the era that predated MTV was Guitar Player Magazine. That was a huge thing because your favorite guitar, it could be Andy Summers, it could be Joe Perry, maybe the first interview that you did with Edward. But those were things back in the day. You didn't really know what these folks looked like that much, or what they had to say, what was on their mind, and that magazine just had everything. It had the columns in the back, the Craig Anderton stuff, some of the incredible transcriptions. But yeah, it could be Lenny Breau, and that's how I found out about all these great players: Lenny Breau, Al Di Meola, Chet Atkins. I mean, I'd heard when I would read about these my favorite players, they would always name drop people that were huge influences on them, and I would go check that out. And so my musical tree kept growing and growing, and it was Charlie Christian, and then Kenny Burrell and Grant Green. It was just, I don't think without that magazine, I that was my biggest influence as a musician here 40 years later.
You know, John, it was interesting because I was, after I got out of grad school at Ohio U, I moved back to Detroit where I'd grown up. And I started working at this company called Gale Research, and we'd write biographies of authors, right? And they used to get in all of these magazines from around the country. And during my lunch break, I would go through the music magazines, and I remember reading Billboard and Cashbox, Rolling Stone. But my two favorites by a long shot were Living Blues magazine,
Yeah.
which I've been writing for every issue for the last 5 years, and Guitar Player. And I used to open up Guitar Player, and in the front of the magazine there was a column called Pros Reply that had a picture of Dan Ford up in the corner. And I used to think in Detroit, I would think, this guy has the best gig in the world. He's living probably in San Francisco.
Yep.
He's interviewing all these great guitar players. And I played guitar back then, as I do today. And, a couple months later, I had that job, and it was my picture up there. And it was like this amazing transformation.
Right. You guys were not unlike radio disc jockeys back in the day. You were kind of, at least to me, the liaisons and almost equal rock stars in your own right. because, in the case of the disc jockeys, they were presenting sometimes interviews on the radio with these musicians and playing the latest recordings. You were doing the same. You were interviewing these folks, becoming good friends with them. I'm sure, in fact, it would be very exciting to hear some of the relationships that developed out of these interviews that maybe you became really dear friends with some of these folks that you interviewed.
I did. I was lucky in that regard. I think the ones I treasured the most in terms of getting to know them a little better than the average person could would be like John Lee Hooker, Eric Johnson, who I still love and is just one of the most wonderful human beings in the world. He's my favorite person to ever be in the music business. Uh, Eddie Van Halen, especially in the days before he married Valerie, I was kind of a sounding board for him. I always enjoyed my relationship with Gatemouth Brown. Um, there's just so many people. I probably did close to 700 interviews.
Right.
Sometimes to me, it was always great when someone I interviewed would request later on that I interview them again. Like Brian May, I remember when I interviewed him, during the course of our conversation, I mentioned this track on the end of a Queen album. That was kind of the oral equivalent of a Max Escher painting, the way the notes rose and came back together. And when I mentioned it, it was like, oh my God, I worked so hard on that, and you're the first person who's ever mentioned it. And
Right.
so I would do my research in advance. And before I'd interview somebody, I would contact the record label and say, send me their catalog, everything they recorded.
Right.
I'd go through all the books and magazines I could find that had interviews or articles about these people, so that when I interviewed them, I went in knowing exactly what I was looking for, and I wouldn't waste any time. I would jump right into it and get to the heart of what their music meant. And I always tried to put myself in the place of who's like Buddy Guy's greatest fan, and what would he want to ask Buddy from a
Right.
guitar player point of view. And so I always did my homework. I'm a college professor now, and it's kind of like if you do your research for the lecture goes really easy and as well. But if you don't, it's going to be really stressful.
Right.
So I'm
Yeah.
a big believer in preparation.
Yeah. Very labored. Yeah. The yeah, what you had just said about developing the relationships with the artists that you had talked to and becoming close friends, but being a sounding board, that had to be pretty exciting to maybe hear tracks that were soon to be released from maybe Fair Warning or Diver Down from Edward, in that era, I would guess maybe the Women and Children First, Diver Down, Fair Warning era that you're
Mhm.
spending the most time with that. But to be able to have him have say, "Hey, Jazz, check this out. This is something that I've been working on."
It's interesting, John. The guys who did that with me, like before they were famous, who contacted me, included like Vi, Satriani, um, and the one who really jumped out was Buckethead, who showed up at the office where I was working, my guitar player office one day, and the secretary receptionist called me and said, "Hey, Jazz, like some kid was just here and he dropped off a demo tape for you." And so I was hanging out with Joe Gore, and Joe said, "Hey, let's just play this and see what it sounds like." So I went up and got the demo tape and went back in the office and played it, and I was like, "Oh my God, this is really different." So I went back to the receptionist and I said, where did this kid go?" And she said, "Well, he's with his mom and dad, and they asked for a place to go have lunch." And I told them about Chili's across the street in Cupertino, California. So Joe and I went over there and we found Buckethead. He was Brian Carroll. He hadn't invented Buckethead yet.
Right.
And he must have been 15 or 16 years old. And I went up and sat down at the table and I said to his mom and dad, your son has a lot of talent. He really has a gift. You should like do whatever you can to promote that. And as we were leaving Chili's, Joe looks at me and he goes, You just made his life, don't you? I'll
Yeah.
never forget that. And Buckethead and I became friends, and he ended up living with me for a while. And I think he's a criminally underrated guitar player. He's one of the best I've ever seen.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it was nice to see these people so earlier in their career. And when you're the first person to interview somebody and put them in a national publication, they never forget it. Like I contacted Joe Satriani a few weeks ago when I wanted his permission to put his first nationally published interview on YouTube. And he wrote me right back, and was cordial and friendly, even though like 25, 30 years had passed since we last hung out. People don't forget that, especially if you treat them right.
Oh, right. Yeah, that would be astounding to hear Joe's early material before it came out because are you talking about the Not of This Earth
No,
material?
there was that record that was just white with the
Oh,
black
the
lettering on
EP.
it.
Yeah, the four or five
Yeah.
song EP.
Yeah, but he was sent me like stuff in advance. People used to send me their rough mixes or their work in progress. Like I have a lot of tapes from Eric Johnson and Satch and people like that,
Mhm.
sort of, and Andy Summers previews of what they were working on.
Yeah,
But that's always precious to hear that.
yeah, yeah, and it's early incarnations. I mean, when I first heard Not of This Earth, um, it was the first time I was exposed to sound because I hadn't really heard a lot of Alan Holdsworth. So
Hmm.
not to compare the two, but there I was hearing sounds that was clearly in a rock vernacular, but I was hearing sounds that would I would later be able to put a post-it note on and say, okay, that's the enigmatic mode that he's using there, or there's certain interesting colors and sounds, and he it was very futuristic to me. It sounded like it was way ahead of his time in terms of what he was doing, attempting to do, and succeeding.
I'll tell you, John, when he was when Holdsworth was in UK, he did a solo on a song called In the Dead of Night that I think is one of the greatest solos of the 20th century. That thing is astounding in his, perception of music and the direction he took it. And oddly enough, the first time I ever heard about Holdsworth was Eddie Van Halen. He kept telling me, "This motherfucker's bad. You got to listen to him. Listen to Death." And he had a profound impact on Eddie.
Yeah. Yeah, I there's no way that I could have transcribed that, but thankfully Steve transcribed it in I guess it was a late '80s Guitar Player magazine, maybe '88 or so. But I remember just looking at the transcription, just going, "My gosh, how am I going to get my?" But I was so enamored with that whole recording, but especially that song. It was just incredible.
Steve Vai, you're talking about, right?
Yeah,
Vai was an expert transcriber. He was like so good. Um, and I had his transcription of Eruption, right? And it was like 7 pages of music paper taped together.
right.
He misspelled Van Halen. He spelled it Hallen on it. And you could see where he had like brown whiteout, where he would like
Oh,
fix notes and all that.
yeah,
And instead of using like typical musical terms, he'd have like balls out on one passage and whatever. And I was given that transcription, and now it's in the archives at the University of North Carolina Southern Folklife Collection because I turned over all of my master tapes and documents and things like that to them a couple of years ago.
but the great thing is it's just right down the street from me.
Oh, really? You're in Chapel Hill?
Well, I'm in, yeah, well, Wake Forest, but North Raleigh.
What happened there was, my dad, I took care of him during the last 10 years of his life. And when he passed away, it really made me aware of my own mortality, And I always saved everything. When I got to Guitar Player, they said, just reuse they gave me one cassette recorder and one cassette tape. And they just said, when you're done with an interview, just use that same tape and tape the next interview over it. And I thought, are you guys nuts?
Oh,
This
right.
is crazy. These are historic documents. I knew that from my first day there. So I went out and bought cases of good quality cassette tapes, and I always used a fresh tape for everybody, and I kept every interview.
Right.
So, anyways, after my dad passed away, a friend of mine named Bill Ferris, who is a professor at the University of North Carolina now, he invited me to lunch in Ann Arbor, where I live, and he asked me about my tapes, and I said, Bill, I'm really concerned about that because when I die, uh, my wife and daughter like don't know who these people are. My wife doesn't know who Alan Holdsworth is, or Andy Summers and people like that. And I said, I'm afraid that this stuff's going to end up in a landfill, and it'll be gone forever, and each one's unique. And he said, no, it's not. The University of North Carolina wants that stuff. So he talked me into donating it all, which is fantastic because they got a grant from the Andrew Mellon Foundation to digitize all the tapes.
Right.
And that's enabled me to start putting all these historic interviews on YouTube.
Yeah.
So while I'm still alive, I want to get as much of this stuff out into the world as I can, because it always seemed to me that the rhythm of musicians' speech very often mirrors the way they play their guitars. By that, I mean, like, if you listen to Buddy Guy in an interview situation, if you're in a closed room with Buddy, he'll talk in a normal tone of voice, and then he'll get really excited and his voice will go up, and then he'll go real low and quiet. And when he's on stage soloing, he'll do the same thing. Or John Lee Hooker would have this kind of menacing stutter and the way he spoke, and you can hear that reflected in his playing sometimes. Or Eddie Van Halen would be like a human pinball in an interview, especially when he was coked out. And his playing sort of had that quality too, that kamikaze, take all the chances and pull it out at the last second kind of approach. So I think to be able to hear the musicians speak adds a whole new dimension to who they are. I wish we had recordings of Charlie Christian talking,
Oh man.
or Robert Johnson, or Nick, or some of the early pioneers like Eddie Lang.
Yeah.
It would be amazing to hear their voices and the cadence of their language.
Yeah. I think I've seen a little clip of Wes Montgomery, and he's being asked a question or two prior to playing. So that was kind of exciting because, like you, that is endlessly thrilling to me. I'm as much as I am a performer, teacher, guitar player, I'm a huge fan, and I just want to know everything I can get my hands on. And I think that's the appeal of Guitar Player magazine, was the fact that I could read an interview with Andy Summers and find out what gear he's using, what the studio recording process. But then a couple pages later, I could read a column by Tommy Tedesco about him tracking guitars for Mission Impossible theme, and then maybe a Lee Ritenour thing, and then Joe Gore would put in something that was just amazing. So actually, guys like yourself and Joe Gore, Mr. Mulhern, Mr. Wheeler, you guys were right up there with my favorite musicians, because you guys were kind of the liaisons into this world that I would never have known about, because I didn't have older siblings that played or were even musicians. None of my friends had any interest in guitar, so I was a loner in that respect. And this magazine gave me the golden key to get into this world I would never have known about.
Yeah, Tom Wheeler, Tom Mulhern, Joe Gore, and I, and later on James Rotundi, we were very close friends, and all of us loved music in this very profound way, especially Tom Wheeler. I mean, that guy just lived and breathed music, and he was an extraordinarily ethical man. He defended us against attacks from advertising and um, other places, and it was such a pleasure to work with him. And Tom Mulhern has the best sense of humor I've ever encountered. So it
Yeah.
was just, we were like a family. Tom was the first to leave, but the 11 years I spent working with Tom, for me, was like the high point of Guitar Player. I think that's when the magazine was at its best, and we were doing our best work, and we all took it seriously. It was a lifestyle as much as it was a day job.
Yeah. The one artist that was the most important in terms of I really, really wanted to hear what they had to say, and I hadn't found a lot of interviews and it was Frank Zappa on the cover where he's holding the Monterey Strat, the Monterey Pop Strat that it was burned up. Just absolutely loved anything in print or audio that I could get my hands on with Frank. So that'd be interesting to hear.
With Frank, it was interesting because you talked to Frank in an interview, and he had like a monotone voice.
Mhm.
But when you read it, it's like the funniest stuff you've ever read.
Right.
But when you're hearing it, it's just like steady stream of consciousness talking. There's a funny anecdote I know about Frank. My friend Tom Mulhern went down to interview Frank around the time that Moon Unit did that Valley Girls rap song.
Yeah, yeah.
And so Mulhern was told in advance by the publicist, whatever you do, do not ask Frank about Moon. And he's like, okay. So he goes to Frank's house and he's sitting there in a room and there's a glass door and Frank's in the next room at his desk getting interviewed by People magazine or some other like more mainstream non-musical publication. Then all of a sudden, Frank like explodes. He reaches over, grabs the interviewer's recording, cassette recorder, takes out the tape, slams it against the side of the desk and breaks it, throws it in the trash and screams, "Get the fuck out of here." So this poor interviewer, I think it might have been a woman, comes scurrying out of the room. And then Frank looks at Mulhern and he goes, "Next." And then he was like nonplussed, like nothing had happened.
Right.
And I always, I like that about some people like Bill Graham are able to channel their energy in such a perfect way and flip the switch and go back to the way they were a minute before.
Right. Yeah. In those two cases, talk about folks that didn't suffer fools. They would, and very uh, both very compelling folks to interview. I would suspect both Bill and Frank.
Bill was a fun guy to talk to. He was serious, but he would talk to anybody. And I remember having a conversation with him about his favorite album, which was I think it was Miles Davis's Sketches of Spain. And so I brought up Kind of Blue, which was my favorite Miles album at the time. And we had just this great conversation, hanging around at the side of the stage, waiting for an act to go on. I always liked Bill being like so down to earth. He
Yeah.
was tough, I wouldn't want to get on his bad side, but I had a lot of respect for him. I always liked him.
Yeah. Um, he seemed like he was equal parts like a throwback to like a Don Arden tough guy. I mean, really hardcore, don't mess with me guy, but also a kid at heart and maybe parts equal parts P.T. Barnum in terms of creating this atmosphere of you never knew what was going to be next. I mean, you could Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Miles Davis, Jimi Hendrix, uh, all these different artists. I mean, to be around that period of time in San Francisco would have been an incredibly fertile period to.
Oh yeah, a lot of people don't know that Bill escaped the Holocaust in Europe. He and his sister, as children, walked across a mountain range so the Nazis couldn't get him. So he had this background, this reserve of strength that was beyond what most of us would ever experience or be able to develop from what he went through as a young person.
Right.
I like him a lot. Santana loved Bill Graham. He just worshiped the guy.
Yeah.
Always had great things to say about him.
Yeah. I want to say that Carlos was one of the folks that I remember performing at the memorial for Bill. I believe.
Yeah.
It was very tragic, but it was interesting to see that Joe would land with his management company because uh, to for Joe to do what he did and for Bill to have the foresight to say this guy is going to be one of the greatest instrumental guitar players of all time was very fortuitous. He must have seen what we all knew, or we all know now, but back when Joe was just getting started, because that I can't think of any guitar player uh, that would have that kind of gravitas that was so big, bold as life to be able to have somebody like Bill Graham be taking him on as management.
And Joe, is such a nice, sweet, down to earth guy and such a hard worker. I think that Graham was certainly attracted to Satriani's work ethic
Right.
and his willingness to put in the hard work to be at the top of his game.
Right.
Yeah, Bill would never have to babysit Joe or make sure he wasn't snorting too much coke or sniffing hair or smoking heroin or whatever. Joe was supremely dedicated, and I'm sure that it appealed to Bill a lot.
Right. Yeah, all the players that you mentioned that you've developed close friendships with, those are all folks that are incredibly focused, but beautiful human beings as much as they are musicians. Eric Johnson, Joe Satriani, Steve Vai, those guys are just really warm, loving, wonderful, very focused, and they knew where they were headed.
Yeah, gotta love it.
Yeah. Are there any other? Is what part of the country did you grow up in?
I grew up out just as you drive into Detroit, there's this gigantic Uniroyal tire. It's probably 8 stories tall or so, and it had been a World's Fair exhibit. I grew up about 200 yards from that tire.
Okay.
And the first time I ever got high in my life was smoking inside that tire when I was 15 years old. So
Wow.
every time I drive by it, I got a smile on my face and a story to tell whoever my driver is.
That must be quite a fragrance because a normal sized tire is got puts off quite a smell. I can imagine.
But it's not made of rubber. It's okay. I thought you meant the reefer we were smoking.
Thinking, can you imagine this, oversized tire? The smell must have been incredible. But
So in Detroit, I was exposed to a lot of black music, especially, which I loved. And uh, that was a real eye opener for me. And I love the blues music even as a someone in high school. And by freshman year of high school, I was really into the blues. And so the Detroit record shops would carry that music, and
right.
it was great.
Yeah, I mean to have befriended somebody like the Detroit Lion himself, Mr. John Lee Hooker. That would be. I mean, he's kind of Detroit's pride, right?
The interesting thing about John was he had worked in the Ford Rouge plant in the steel mill back in the let's see, this would have been in the 50s probably. And I ended up working in that same steel mill during my summers when I was in college. I'd come home to Detroit, and on a Monday and my Tuesday night, I was working the midnight shift in the steel mill. So right off the bat, John and I had a connection together to me because I had worked in the same facility he did. But even more important, at one time I was living with a woman named Bonnie, and when we broke up, she moved in with John Lee Hooker, and so we had this, and he couldn't handle her either. So, so we had this woman in common. Like John had trouble remembering people, especially white people. It's that old um, stereotype that you can't. It's hard for some people to remember people of the opposite of a different race. Um, but he always remembered me because he'd be like, you was Bonnie's guy.
Yeah.
So instantly he would know who I was and would warm up because we'd had the steel mill and the Bonnie experience together. And so I really treasured the many interviews I did with him. It was like sitting at the foot of a master in the Eastern philosophy tradition and just being a receptacle for whatever he wanted to say, you know.
Right.
What a remarkable guy,
Yeah.
unforgettable human being.
Yeah. Uh, one
He
of the
could he could walk into a studio and create an album's worth of new songs on the spot.
Yeah.
Like Lightning Hopkins could do that, you know. What a talent. And he couldn't read or write. To be able to just do that and remember it all, amazing.
Yeah, it'd be hard pressed to find somebody as influential as a musician as John Lee Hooker. I mean, he's was massive impact on our generation of guitar players.
Well, he had an especially big impact, excuse me, on other blues guitar players, who in turn influenced, uh, you know, rock and rollers. For instance, you know, like Buddy Guy, first thing he's learning as a musician is like Boogie Chillin' by John Lee Hooker.
Right.
And so he passed through these different, in Van Morrison's band, them and the Animals, and all these different groups were into John Lee Hooker. So it was interesting because the American blues music flowed through the British guys and then was given back to the American youth through their covers on records.
Yeah.
And Muddy Waters famously said, you know, American kids, you know, they got crying for bread and they got it in their own backyard, you know.
Right.
Like a lot of us, we, you know, we learned about the blues musicians through the songwriting credits on albums.
Oh yeah, Led Zeppelin for sure. I mean,
Who's
I
who's
wouldn't know.
Willie? Yeah, Led Zeppelin. Who's Willie Dixon? You know, and that was the journey you take.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that Santana was also hugely inspired or influenced by John Lee Hooker.
John Lee Hooker, you know, you couldn't help but be influenced by him as a not just as a musician, but if you knew him as the whole package, the total guy.
Yeah.
He's real loving. He seems like tough as nails on records, but he told me, and I believe him, that he had never once in his life been in a fight.
Oh,
And you know, you hear him on the records, and you think this is a guy who's going to chew you up and spit you out. But in real life, he was this sweet,
yeah.
understanding guy. I mean, he wouldn't take BS from anybody, but he didn't have to. But he was just my idea of what a man should be in a lot of ways.
Yeah. It's harkening back to the conversation earlier where you were saying, you know, it's the a dream job. It expanded your horizons and your even if you weren't a fan of maybe let's say, and I don't know this to be true, but if you're not a fan of progressive rock, let's say, and you're more into the blues, interviewing somebody like Alex Lifeson of Rush or Steve Hackett or somebody in the progress gave you a different insight to their world, or maybe if not necessarily a classical guitarist talking to Christopher Parkening or Julian Bream or some of these folks. It's just it would have been an amazing fertile experience for a young guy to be talking to all these different musicians from all these different walks of life and parts of the country or you know.
Well, to give you just one brief glimpse, there was one day, I think it was on a Saturday or a Sunday, where in the morning I did a cover story interview with Ingve.
Yeah.
And then I went across the bridge and did a cover story interview with Jerry Garcia
Yeah.
on the same day.
Same day.
You know, that's the world I was in. It was really, um, I was really lucky.
Yeah. Yeah, and both equally fascinating folks, but from could not be more. It would be both you and I are huge fans of music. It would be hard to find a through line to where they might intersect something in common between the two of them, but equally fun reads and explorations into where they came from and what they were up to and where they were headed and that sort of thing.
You know, it's funny. My first day at guitar player, um, I came into work and they said we need a record review right now. So I wrote a review of a Mance Lipscomb album, and we shipped the boards for the magazine out. And then I went over to the this record player we had out in a common area with headphones. I was listening to a new record by Jeff Beck, and Tom Wheeler came by, and I mentioned that I preferred Jeff Beck's playing to Eric Clapton's, and Tom said, "Jazz, if you want to really do well as a music journalist, it'd be best to just find the good in all the different people that you're listening to." And I really took that to heart. And I was lucky because I got to choose who I interviewed, and I never did interviews with people whose music I wasn't interested in. I could always assign those to another journalist, and there were always people wanting to do stories for us.
Yeah.
So if I covered the person, it's because I like the music.
Right. And I think that was the thing that excited me above any other magazine that I've seen, is that it felt like you guys, I knew that everybody involved with Guitar Player had impeccable taste, because I knew, even if I didn't know the artist on the cover, that was somebody I needed. It was important that I check this person out. Even if I didn't end up liking, there's something very fascinating, something to be learned from this person. It was,
Yeah,
you guys were very selective. It wasn't just, because there's hundreds of thousands of guitar players, but you guys picked just if you looked at, and I had every guitar player magazine from probably 77 through probably 2012, I think. And they were filled up a room, it seemed. But I would look at the covers and go, it was kind of like a little art gallery of these, and the shots were very well done.
mhm.
Great taste. It was a great learning experience. But I always felt like I said, whoever was on the cover, that was somebody that I needed to find out about.
Yeah, I guess I was lucky because I was the chief copy editor the 20 years I was there. So I literally read every word that ever went in that magazine from 78 till 98 and put my stamp on it before it would get into print. So my head I'm like a walking encyclopedia of guitar guys and
Yeah.
women. It's
I
just live and breathe it.
yeah. Uh, when I really got into playing in earnest and decided that this was the career path for me, I knew that my path wasn't necessarily going to be in a rock band, because I could never cultivate a look to be a typical uh, rock guitar god. So I tended to gravitate towards studio guitar players: Larry Carlton, Lee Ritenour, Dean Parks, Steve Lukather, Ray Parker Jr., those guys. But I did want to perform live, and I had seen Pink Floyd in concert, so I really owe all of my guitar playing um, experience to the being inspired by David Gilmour. And that had to be the best day of my life when I saw the 1984 cover of David Gilmour, because he had just released the About Face record. That magazine cover is my favorite of all. That's my favorite interview, my favorite magazine of all time. So I don't know if you were the one that interviewed.
I didn't do that one.
Yeah,
The one I regret not doing because I didn't get deeply into his music till after I left the magazine was Richard Thompson. I wish that I knew about Richard then what I know now. Like if you listen to a song, the live version of Can't Win, I
yeah,
just wish I'd put him on the cover because extraordinary musician, taking things in a new direction and great songwriter. I've always been attracted to songwriting as much as guitar playing, if not more so.
yeah. Any particular songwriters that stand out as your favorites?
Oh yeah, right off the top, Bob Marley and Jimi Hendrix. I love Dylan in the '60s, especially. Um, but the songwriter I listen to the most by far is Marley. And I love Curtis Mayfield. The thing that Mayfield and Marley have in common is they created music that was equally suited for the jailhouse and the cathedral. Their music was secular and spiritual at the same time. And Marley's message of, get up, stand up for your rights, it just resonated. In my journeys around the world, the one thing I've noticed is everywhere I've ever traveled overseas, like England, the Spanish Steps in Rome, etc., I could hear Bob Marley music. It was transcultural. And so that's my favorite music to listen to. And Hendrix, I wrote a book a few years ago, 2, 3 years ago, about his 9 months in England before he became famous in America. And I really developed a deep appreciation for his songwriting because I started to explore the backstories of these songs and how he did them. Like on my Talking Guitar magazine on Substack, I just posted articles about how Jimmy wrote Purple Haze and what it means, and Red House. And I've always been interested in how these things are, how the songwriters are inspired, how they put it together, and where they take it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like Otis Rush would tell me that he was standing at a bus stop, and a woman came up and accosted another woman, and she said, "If you ever mess with my man again, you're going to have double trouble." And Otis is like, "Double trouble? I like that." So he writes the song Double Trouble, and Stevie Ray Vaughan hears it,
Yeah.
named his band Double Trouble. Or John Lee Hooker saying, um, I asked him where Boom Boom came from, and he said that he used to play at the club in Detroit, and he was always late. And he'd walk in the door, and the waitress would look at him and go, "Boom Boom, late again. Boom Boom, late again." So while he was there, he just made up this song, Boom Boom, and started playing it on stage, and people went crazy over it. And he recorded it and had like a really important R&B hit in the early 50s with it. So I like that aspect of music as much as the guitar playing stuff, to be honest.
Yeah, it seems to me like Hendrix, had he lived, would probably have gone much deeper into the songwriting aspect because as much as he loved playing guitar, and the guitar would always be in the mix, but it seemed like that was his thing, was lyrics and songs and creating soundscape and just telling stories or having a narrative. I mean, it seemed like he was wildly passionate, as influenced by Dylan as he would have been influenced by Buddy Guy or whomever.
With Jimmy, you have this poetry. His lyrics are poetry. If you just read him as words, without the music, it's like he'd get an A in my creative writing class.
Yeah, yeah. I remember reading as a kid, reading the lyrics to "Castles Made of Sand." Just like you know,
Yeah.
and that's some deep stuff.
I
From a
got to know Jimmy's dad really well, and that was a wonderful experience because when I was a kid, like my first hero was Sandy Koufax, the baseball player for the
oh yeah,
Dodgers.
yeah,
And then when I got a guitar, Jimi Hendrix became my hero. And uh, when I was asked to write a book with Jimmy's dad, it was like, yeah, sign me up. To be able to sit down for many days with Al Hendricks and just hear the voice that Jimmy grew up with, hear the stories that Jimmy grew up with, to sit on the couch that Jimmy sat on when he learned to play guitar, to look at the stereo he played, to hold his instruments that his dad had, to look at his artwork. It was as close as I could possibly get to Jimmy,
right.
as reflected through his dad. And that was an amazing experience.
Yeah, it seemed like it was a single parent home in Seattle. Is that right? For the
He
most.
was, yeah, his dad raised him as a single parent. And Jimmy had a really rough upbringing. I mean, there were many times where he didn't have enough to eat, didn't have good clothes, would go over to the neighbor's house to try to get some food in them. He had shoes that had holes in them, and Al would give him a fresh piece of cardboard to put in the shoes so that he'd have a little bit of protection from the cold in the wintertime. And he really had a difficult upbringing.
Yeah, and I I guess he had two half siblings, Leon and
I
Janine.
think he had 4 or 5.
Okay. Those are the two that I knew of, Leon and Janine.
There was Leon and Joey,
Okay.
and Leon and Joey were the children of Jimmy's mother.
Okay.
Al may not have been the father of Lee. In fact, Al told me he wasn't Leon's father. Um, and then there was a girl who came along later because when Jimmy came back to Seattle as a superstar, Al was kind of clueless about how important Jimmy was as a musician. And when he went to the airport to get him, there were hundreds of young people like hanging out waiting to get a view of Jimmy. And Al's like wondering like, what are all these people? Why are all these people here? What are they waiting on?
Right.
And then he saw Jimmy on a billboard as they were driving home, and he realized, like, anyways, a girl in the neighborhood, a little girl in the neighborhood, came over to get Jimmy to sign an album. And as Al was watching her, he noticed like certain mannerisms in the way she moved, and he thought to himself, she looks like she could be Lucille's daughter. Lucille was his wife, and it turned out she was, although Al didn't know about her at the time. And so Al thought it was ironic that the girl who came over to get Jimmy to sign the record was actually his half sister,
Yeah.
although neither of them knew it at the time.
Right. Yeah. The that would be a very interesting period to hear about. Jimmy in his teens moving into young adulthood, and because he had such a fertile imagination as a kid.
That's for sure. Yeah, he is. It's funny because he put his imagination into artwork until his mother died. And when Lucille died, he uh, started to play guitar after his mom died. Let me get a picture to show you for a second.
Okay.
When I was working with Al, I think it was the second day of interviews,
Hey,
he
hey,
kind of,
yes, bear with me for. I'm just going to use the restroom real quick. I had a large coffee, so
oh,
we'll
go ahead.
we'll edit this out. Be just a second. Sorry about that.
So when Al and I started, are you back on?
Yeah, back on.
So when Al and I started working together on the second day of interviews, he goes back into his bedroom and he gets down on his hands and knees and reaches under the bed and he pulls out this box and he takes off the lid, and inside of it are maybe several dozen drawings and paintings by Jimi Hendrix done before, he became a musician. And one of these drawings, I don't know if you can see this or not.
Oh wow.
It's Al laying back on a couch with his hand over his eyes, right?
Yeah.
And I was looking at it, and Jimmy captioned it, Daddy's Sleeping, right? It's dated February 7th, 1958.
Wow.
This is right around the time of Jimmy's mother's funeral. Al would not take Jimmy to the funeral, so Jimmy couldn't go to his mom's funeral, which I think profoundly upset him. But anyways, he did this drawing, which to me really captures the kind of sorrow and angst that was going on in the Hendrix house at that time.
Yeah.
This is the My Son Jimmy's, what this is called.
Yeah.
Anyways, so
Beautiful.
after that, Jimmy started hanging around a guy in the rooming house. They lived in rooming houses, who played guitar. And Al came home one day and he saw broom straws on the floor. And Al was really strict. And he's like, Jimmy, what are these straws doing on the floor? And Jimmy said, I was playing guitar, pretending I was playing guitar. And so Al ended up buying that guitar off the guy in the house. And that was the beginning of Jimmy, the musician, you know.
Yeah.
He was about 15 at the time. It's extraordinary if you think about how quickly Jimi Hendrix progressed, you know.
Yeah.
He only played guitar 12 years and then died, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. What, my goodness, what he did in such a short period of time. Uh, in the last couple of weeks, I've been incredibly blessed to interview folks like yourself. And interestingly, the through line has been, I think, every single person has at some point in the interview discussed the impact of Jimmy. Um, I have students right now. I have a young kid who's 9, and he is absolutely over the moon with Jimmy. He can't play everything, but he is working, so he's so driven. He's not
Mhm.
interested in video games, but Jimmy's legacy is just, and his impact on us as musicians and guitar players. It's extraordinary for such a small window of time that he was with us.
Yeah, he was only in the spotlight for about 3 years.
Yeah.
Late
I
66, December 66, basically, till he died in September of 70.
I grew up in Cincinnati, and the Isley brothers are from Cincinnati, and I've always heard legends of Jimmy being in that area, working with them, and that sort of thing. And then they were, I think they went from Cincinnati to New Jersey, Teaneck, New Jersey, I believe. But it was interesting to hear the story, things that I would hear about when Jimmy was coming out of the army and just starting to really get things taking off, playing with King Curtis and the Isley brothers and Little Richard and that sort of thing. Um, Even then, he seemed to be a larger than life persona as a backing man, as a side man.
Hmm. Yeah, Ernie Isley, who is a wonderful guitar player, and you should interview him if you get a chance because he's so much fun, told me that when he was a kid, he would look out of his bedroom window and look down and see Jimmy playing basketball with his famous brothers.
Yeah,
Can you imagine
yeah,
experiencing?
yeah, yeah. What was interesting is before I got into rock, I was just a kid going to the skating rink. We would listen to R&B records. I mean, I was hearing more Isley Brothers, Commodores, Parliament Funkadelic. So guitar, my earliest memories of guitar heroes were Ernie Isley and Eddie Hazel and
Well,
the guys
Maggot Brain.
that get brain, that kind of stuff. So I was hearing that kind of thing, and when I first got into Hendrix, I was kind of like, man, that dude's ripping off Ernie Isley. He looks because Ernie. I was a kid. And what did I know? But I had the live Isley Brothers record, "Go for Your Guns," and off to the right side of the stage, you see Ernie dressed in the white thing and the headband and all that kind of stuff. Now he's playing right-handed guitar, but I just thought, man, that is the coolest look ever. And then come to when I started getting into Hendrix, it was like, oh, okay, I didn't know. Well,
Yeah, Hendrix is the font of that kind of stuff, really. You know, when I think about guitar, John, I'm always come back to this thought about how rapidly it expanded. It's only a dozen years from Chuck Berry recording Johnny Be Good
yeah,
to Jimi Hendrix playing the Star Spangled Banner at Woodstock, which I consider the most important piece of music to come out of the 1960s because it encapsulated so much of what was going on for socially conscious young people. And I was a part of that group, you know, with the bombs going off and the sonic effects and all that. I think that's just a transcendent piece of music, the same way Blind Willie Johnson's Dark Was the Night was a transcendent piece of music in the 1920s. You know, this is just something like that came to us from a better place, from beyond.
right.
whatever. And I got to hand it to Jimmy. He more than anyone else, he single-handedly rewrote the rules of rock guitar and expanded the borders. I see Eddie Van Halen is coming out of Jimi Hendrix, even though Eddie didn't like Jimmy that much. I think Jimmy's accomplishments in that 3-year period are just unsurpassed.
Right. The things that were happening in the guitar landscape when Aria Experience came out, even though there was some fuzz tone stuff from maybe the Kinks or the Who or that kind of stuff, and some blues rock stuff, generally speaking, in Middle America, what you're used to hearing come from the guitar is stuff like "Walk Don't Run,"
Yeah,
you know,
the Ventures.
surf guitar stuff. Um, I mean, the Beatles had some interesting distorted guitar stuff, but there were parts that served the better. They're parts that serve the song. But to hear something like backwards guitar or just to hear that big intro to Purple Haze and just the sound of it and all the backwards effects and swirling stuff and it was like something from another planet. You couldn't have possibly, and of course that I was not old enough to. I was a year old when that came out, year and a half old. But even hearing it later, it was way ahead of its time in the mid '70s for me when I was really digesting it then. So I can't imagine a fully developed guitar player hearing that for the first time.
The thing is you listen to Hendrix's first album or All Along the Watchtower or Eddie Van Halen playing Eruption or Alan Holdsworth doing In Dead of Night solo or Andy Summers doing the Driven to Tears solo on the Police record. This stuff is eternally fresh to me.
Yeah.
Another one is Phil Keaggy had a song called Sounds that
Yeah.
every rock guitarist should listen to because the solo is so magnificent. And to me, it's like I get the same emotional jolt from it today as I did the first time I heard it. And there's not a whole lot of music that has that quality.
Right. Yeah, they were. It it's still staggering to think that there was all the. It's a relatively young thing as far as the electric guitar. It's not. It's not like it's something that's been around for hundreds of years, but the distance that has been traveled and the innovators of the guitar. Having said that, it would be hard to think that we'll ever see, at least in our lifetime, something that would have the impact of Jimmy or Eddie. I
Well,
can't.
if you want to talk about impact, you got to go back to late 1930s, Charlie Christian.
Yeah.
That was like the seismic guitar change of the 20th century in some ways. And if you go to my YouTube Talking Guitar channel, there's an interview there with Barney Kessel, the great jazz guitar player, the studio guy. And Barney knew Charlie Christian, jammed with him, and he talks about what it was like when Charlie Christian came on the scene and the impact it had on him and other people. And it's quite remarkable the way Barney describes it and Charlie's personality. Charlie's really the font of the electric guitar. This is where it all starts, and you have to give Christian credit for that. And like Jimi Hendrix, he had like 3 years in the limelight and then he died. It's an
Yeah.
awful pattern with some of these guys.
I don't know that I would have been aware as soon as I was, if it weren't of Charlie Christian, if it weren't for Danny Gatton reading an interview about how much he loved Charlie Christian and going back and checking that out. But Danny was another guy that was, you know, who knows what more he could have done.
I loved watching him play. He'd pick up a beer bottle in the club and then play the guitar with it. He's an entertaining guy, that's for sure.
Yeah. So, uh, and if I can go check out some of your stuff at the UNC. Is that right?
No, yeah, but if people are interested in like reading some of the old interviews or articles or new articles. I have a magazine on Substack called Talking Guitar. And then my friend Nick Hunt talked me into taking some of the interview tapes and turning them into podcasts. And so if you go over to YouTube and look up Talking Guitar, I have, I don't know, maybe 70 interviews up there and maybe 100, 150 articles on the Substack thing. And I try to do an ecumenical range of material. Like I just recorded the intros for the next 4 podcasts, and they were like Nick Lucas, who was the first guitar star in American history back in the 20s, Luther Allison, Alex Lifeson in a hotel room, and I forget who the fourth one was, but it was somebody great. Anyways, I have so much backlog of material. I have enough to keep me busy for the next 5 or 10 years, probably.
Yeah, I'd love
So I
to.
tell all you young music journalists, save your tapes, save your recordings.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Uh, so we need to go to check out those interviews. Go to Talking Guitar on the YouTube.
YouTube and Substack is another. So if you like to read, Substack is the place to go. And if you like to listen, YouTube's the place to go.
Yeah. Um, One thing that it was super exciting to check out recently that I performed with a Pink Floyd tribute group, and we were doing some shows up north in Ohio, and I got to go see Andy Summers do a solo one-man show called Cracked Lens and a Missing String, where he performs police tunes by himself with some backing and some looping and stuff. And he's got a retrospective of his photography, and he tells stories and anecdotes about really interesting stuff. But that, if you get a chance to either see it on YouTube, there's some clips of it, or see it in your area, it's a really fantastic evening worth of entertainment.
One of my favorite cover story interviews for guitar players was with Andy Summers at the height of the Police. And Andy and Keith Richards are the most articulate people I've ever interviewed, in that you can transcribe their words exactly, and it's perfect English from start to finish. These guys speak Queen's English, really. And I posted that Andy Summers audio with his kind permission on YouTube. So that's one of the interviews that's up there. But he really dives deep into how he thinks about music, how he creates solos. Um, yeah, he's an extraordinary guitar player. I really like his playing, both
Yeah,
with the Police and instrumentally.
yeah. He's I would consider it the this one of the high marks of this podcast to interview him. It would be a dream come true to interview. He's because one of my biggest influences, and I think he would be an incredible engaging, like yourself. One,
Here's an interesting thing to ask him about. When Jimi Hendrix was living in New York City and he was dead broke and homeless, Chaz Chandler from the Animals recruited him to become his client, and he flies him over to England in late September 1966. From the airport, he drives Jimmy to somebody's house. Andy Summers was in the house that day. So Andy Summers is one of the 3 or 4 people, Kathy Etchingham was there too. They were one of the 3 or 4 first people Jimmy met in England.
yeah.
So Andy, like a lot of people don't realize, but Andy's a touchstone for
Oh,
early Jimi Hendrix information,
yeah, oh, yeah.
because he was playing in a psychedelic band, Dan Talion's Chariot or something like that, and before he went into the Animals and then later on the Police. And so fascinating guy. He'd be a great subject for a book, actually, Andy would, because of the extraordinary things he's seen and the great music he's created.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't had any luck finding any management email information on him yet, so I'm still.
I'll forward you something. You know, we mentioned that Driven to Tears solo from
Oh yeah.
Andy, which is sounds like it comes way out of left field. The first time I heard it, I was over at a house of a friend of mine named Pat Thrall, who played in Pat Travers' band and then Asia and all these other bands. And so I go over to Pat's house and we're hanging out and he goes, "Hey, have you heard Zenyatta Mandata?" And I said, No, I think I have a copy, but I haven't played it yet." And he says, "There's something you got to hear." He said, "This is either the greatest solo I have ever heard or a mistake." And he dropped the needle. I'm driven to tears. And when that solo came in, it was like chills went through my body. And I just thought, how could anyone have thought this up? And when I talked to Andy, he mentioned it was a first take, off the cuff.
Yeah.
Love how people can think like that, you know?
Yeah. Oh
In a
yeah.
100 years, I couldn't have come up with that solo.
But since you mentioned him, I've got something to share with you. Hold on. My Andy Summers relict telly.
Wow. Looks just like it. You know, I have a telly that's got the same kind of finish and all that, but it's called a JD, a Jerry Donahue telly.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I've given away most of my electric guitars, but hung on to that one and a 1962 harmony guitar that looks like a Les Paul, but it's made out of like countertop or something.
Oh.
But I love that thing. You know, I can play it at home without disturbing anybody.
Oh, nice. Look at
Yeah,
that.
this is my favorite
Yeah.
electric guitar, and I got it for $30 at the San Jose flea market.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that as we're wrapping things up, you mentioned two players that are definitely on my bucket list for the show is Pat Thrall and Andy Summers. I'm very enamored with Pat's playing.
He's a swell human being. I really like Pat. You can find him on Facebook.
Yeah, I'll look him up on Facebook. But yeah, if you had an email address for Andy, that would be amazing. You've been an incredible guest. Thank you.
Hey, my pleasure, and thank you for doing this.
Yeah, it's I think when people will anybody that's likely to tune into this will know your name because we as guitar players, I mean, Guitar Player Magazine is ubiquitous. I mean, and I'm sure that everybody will instantly take to your site. And I'm hoping that it will cause some sort of groundswell for people to go out and find out what I found about your Talking Guitar series. I've really enjoyed them quite a bit.
Well, thanks, John. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And excited that the Rangers won the World Series. That was a very special thing. It's been hard over the years to, even though I'm a Cincinnatian, to follow the Reds. It's been heartbreak after heartbreak.
I'm a lifelong Dodgers and Tigers fan, and I was rooting for Philly for the World Series because my daughter lives in Philly. But I wanted the Rangers to whip the Rattlesnakes, and they did.
Oh man, did they ever?
They spanked them. It was fun to watch. I enjoyed the whole series.
Yeah, Seager
That's
and
the only sport I watch is the World Series.
right. I
I,
usually tune in around the playoffs and watch the World Series, but I don't. I'm not a big. My wife is a longtime Dodgers fan. Her family knew Vin Scully, and
oh wow.
so she grew up in Reseda, and they were always going to Dodger games, so she's a huge Dodgers fan.
Actually, John, I'm so into music and literature that I have never ever seen an entire football, basketball, or hockey game ever.
Yeah.
No interest. But
Yeah.
the World Series, yeah, I'll watch that every time in the playoffs.
Oh yeah, it really it builds to a fever pitch much more than like the Super Bowl or whatever. There's something about a world, especially a good World Series, and it seemed like the way it was shaping up. I thought it was going to go to all the way to Game 7, but
If the Eagles go to the Super Bowl, I'll watch that because my kid's in Philly and everybody loves the birds, and it's kind of like a thing
That
we can do together remotely.
that's a sore thing for me because I'm a Cowboys fan, and
Oh, that must hurt. I'm sorry to hear that. Well, good
yeah,
luck.
everybody. That's it takes a busload of love to support the cow because it's right up there. I don't know which is worse, to be a Cowboys fan or a Yankees fan, because it's just real. You get a lot of grief, like, oh my God, I hate the Cowboys. But
My brother, who's been a encyclopedia of baseball his whole life, always says to me, rooting for the Yankees is like rooting for Wall Street.
I,
Okay, John, thank you very much.
thanks, Jazz. Thanks so much.
Be well.
You as well.
Thank you for tuning in to the Guitar Hang Podcast, interviews with noteworthy guitar players from around the world. Go ahead and hit the subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications to stay updated on our latest episodes.